All right, what is up, y'all? So I'm excited to bring this talk to you today. We actually had a live talk on this topic, and the recording did not come out as great as I wanted it to, but it's all good because this is going to be awesome and probably just a little bit more concise. But this is for my people that are embracing animal foods and eating meat, and they get the question, how can you eat all that meat and saturated fat? And if you don't get the question, I can almost guarantee you that people are thinking about it as they see you doing what you're doing. Now, the proof is in the results of what you experience, bottom line. The way that you feel, the way that you look, feel, and perform, and that's all you need to know. But what I want for you today is a knowledge of some indisputable facts. I also want you to have confidence in what you're eating and how you're eating. And then if you want it, I want you to have the ability to talk intelligently about this topic so that if you are asked this question, you can talk about it with pride. Okay? So let's just get into it. Here's what we're doing for today. We're going to talk about what saturated fat is. We're going to talk about is saturated fat harmful and how much saturated fat is actually in meat. All right? Some really pertinent things to understand and know as it pertains to that question. So, first of all, what do you think about when you hear the term saturated fat? And maybe what you think about in the context of eating real food now is different than what you used to think about before. But maybe think back to before you learned the truth about real food. Like, what did you think about when you heard the term saturated fat? We got some good answers in our live call, but for a lot of us, I think saturated fat equates to being overweight. Saturated fat equates to having heart disease. Saturated fat to me sounds greasy and slimy and cloggy because it clogs your arteries, right? Even though we know the truth to be very different from that. It's almost like this is intentional. And I feel like we need to change the verbiage of saturated fat to something a little bit more accurate. So what is a saturated fatty acid? So we have a picture here of a fatty acid that is stearic acid. It's one of the fatty acids, dominant fatty acids in tallow, which is why tallow is one of my favorite things to consume. But anyway, what do we mean by saturated fat or saturated fatty acid? Saturated means that all of the carbon atoms are bonded to hydrogen atoms, and you can see that in this picture here. There's nothing that's left open. All right, so this fatty acid is fully saturated with hydrogen atoms. That's where they get the term saturated. Okay, which is why maybe we can come up with a different term. So these saturated fatty acids are, because everything is occupied, they are extremely stable, and they do not go rancid easy. They're very resistant to damage and very resistant to heat. Right, so it makes them ideal for cooking. Okay, it also makes them ideal for body structure. We'll talk a little bit about that here in a little bit. They're also traditionally solid or semi-solid at room temperature because they are so stable, right? So, and we know that we put some tallow or some butter or something or coconut oil out on the counter and it stays relatively solid. Now also, they contain a lot of nutritional value because they're almost always packaged with the all-important fat-soluble nutrients, vitamins A, D, E, and K. Our bodies prefer saturated fatty acids in their varying forms for structure and for energy. So they're a really great source of fat-based energy. And they're typically found in animal fats and tropical oils, although we'll see in a little bit, all fats contain a combination of all three types of fats. All right, so another way that we could label saturated fats or saturated fatty acids would be stable fats, because that's exactly what they are. They're extremely stable. Now, the second type of fat is the monounsaturated fat or fatty acid. All right, so monounsaturated means there's one unsaturation because there's one pair of hydrogen atoms missing, and so the carbon bonds to itself through a double bond. And so this fatty acid is not fully saturated with hydrogen atoms. It's one not saturated, which is why it's called monounsaturated. Now, this also means because it has this weak spot in its structure that it is less stable. It's more likely to go rancid, it's less resistant to damage, and less resistant to heat. Now, you'll also notice that things are dominant in monounsaturated. They're going to be liquid at room temperature, and we see that with olive oil sitting on the counter, or macadamia nut oil, or avocado oil. But they're also used for structure and energy inside the body. And typically they're found in olive oil and avocado oil and nuts and seeds and some meats. Now, because we have this one pair of hydrogen atoms missing and it's relatively unstable, instead of monounsaturated, we could call this unstable fat. And then finally, we have polyunsaturated fats or polyunsaturated fatty acids. All right, poly meaning multiple, because there's more than one pair of hydrogen atoms that's missing. And so this fatty acid is not fully saturated with hydrogen atoms either, and it has at least 2 locations where that's happening. And because we have these 2 open spots in this fatty acid, that makes it extremely unstable. It goes rancid very easily, it's damaged very easily, and it's not resistant to heat at all. In fact, being exposed to air or light or heat in any way actually makes it extremely volatile. Now, these are always liquid, even at room temperature. They're found in things like flax and nuts and fish and seeds and fish oils, and they're found dominantly in very unhealthy, highly processed plant-based oils like canola, corn, soybean, vegetable, and all the different highly processed plant-based oils that we recommend people avoid. But because these are polyunsaturated, which means polyunstable, a better term might be polyunstable fat or highly unstable fat. I actually really like that term. So coming back to our different new names now, we've got, instead of saturated fat, we've got stable fat. It's a strong fat. Instead of monounsaturated, we've got unstable fat. And then instead of polyunsaturated, we've got highly unstable fat. All right? That's much more representative of the quality of these types of fats. Now, as a bonus, we have a quality and cooking with fats and oils where we actually rank different fats. We give you the percentages of saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated, and we tell you what kind of fat to get within the context of whatever the fat is we're talking about here, but we actually rank these based on cooking and non-cooking. This is a PDF that is actually inside of our group, SuperHumans United. You can download it there, along with all the other resources that we're talking about here today. So, based on this basic information that we just learned together, just based on the structure of these fatty acids, which type of fatty acid would you rather be built with? I'd like to be built with something strong. Which type of fatty acid would you rather cook with? I'd like to cook with something that's not going to be damaged very easy. All right, that's just something to think about. So, a quote to yourself and to others, if you decide to talk intelligently about this, is saturated fat is actually very stable fat. Monounsaturated fat is unstable fat. Polyunsaturated fat is very unstable fat. All right, so next big question, which is saturated fat harmful? Well, first of all, humans have to consume fat because there's essential nutrients in fat. Now, essential meaning from a nutritional perspective, we cannot make it inside the body, so we have to get it from external sources. That does not mean that if something is non-essential, it's not extremely important and extremely healthful. But there are essential fatty acids and things that we get from fat. So, for example, the omega-3s and omega-6s that we hear a lot about in mainstream news and probably mainstream nutrition, these are essential. Like, we need to get these in the diet. And it just so happens that if you're eating real food, you are getting those in the diet. But we're making a point here that fat is extremely important for human beings, right? Human beings have to consume fat because we need these nutrients. Now, also, fat contains the fat-soluble nutrients, vitamins A, D, E, and K. Fat-soluble meaning that they need the presence of fat to be digested and assimilated properly, and they're packaged inside fat. That's how Mother Nature works. You know, they package fat-soluble nutrients with fat so that when you eat the fat, you get the fat-soluble nutrients and you can absorb them, right? So we have to consume fat. Fats, in general, in a big picture way of looking at things, fats and fatty acids contribute to structure in the body. If I look at my body, like my body is not just bone, it's not just protein or muscle. Even muscle, the matrix in muscle has a lot of fatty acids in it, right? You can see that. You can see it in a steak when you cut a steak open, right? So a large part of this body, this structure of this body is fatty acid based. Also, we get tremendous nutritional value from fats because again, we have the fat-soluble nutrients packaged with it. And then we're getting a lot of great fat-based energy, and we all know we're trying to train the body how to use fat for fuel, so where else are we going to get healthy fats to use for fuel besides fatty acids? So we're making an argument here for fat. Now, some of you may be familiar with this. This is in our Mastering Real Food for a Lifetime guide. So we have what we call the roles of healthy fats in the body. A lot of people don't understand this, so it's good to review it. So, number one, provides an energy source that is not glucose-based, which is the ultimate goal, or one of the goals that we're trying to accomplish with the SHT, which is training the body how to be metabolically flexible. Fatty acids, like we mentioned before, contribute to structure. They contribute to structure at the cellular level. So, all of our cell membranes are made of a fat layer or a bilipid layer, a fatty acid layer. And the question is, like, what do you want that layer to be made of? Because the cells combine together to create tissues, to create organs, to create organ systems, to create this organism. And that's how a lot of the structure is created, is from these fatty acids. Now, we already mentioned that fatty acids or fats are required for the absorption of fat-soluble nutrients. Every time we consume fat, we also stimulate our gallbladder, because when we eat fat and fat goes into our small intestine, the gallbladder squeezes to squirt bile into the small intestine, and that bile is like Dawn dishwashing liquid. It will break up the fat to make it easier to digest. So when we eat fat, we're helping ourselves digest fat, we're keeping our gallbladder active. But then also, the gallbladder is where the liver stores a bunch of its toxins. So in the process of creating bile, it does it through toxins and cholesterol and some other things. When we squirt bile into the small intestine to digest fats, we then excrete the bile through our waste, and so we're detoxifying. So fat helps us detoxify. And in the presence of sugar or glucose, fat is going to help you slow the absorption rate and also minimize the impact on blood sugar levels, right? So if I just have straight sugar, that's going to give me a blood sugar spike that is way different from having, some sugar with some fat in it. So we had a good discussion in the group, though. Like, if I'm having a piece of fruit on its own, do I need to eat some fat with it? Probably not, because it's a real food-based, sugar. But the point here is that it's good to have fat with things because it blunts the impact on blood sugar levels of whatever it is you're consuming. And then inflammation in the body is managed by fatty acid precursors, right? These fatty acid precursors contribute to what we call the prostaglandin pathways, all right? So again, we're just making an argument for consuming fat. This is a picture of a cell membrane and the fatty acid layers, the bilipid layer, the phospholipid layer. And then also we see in here a lot of cholesterol. Why? Because every cell in the body makes its own cholesterol, so that's a whole other discussion. But so again, fats, big picture way of looking at things, fats and fatty acids contribute to structure in the body. They give us great nutritional value because of the essential nutrients and the fat-soluble nutrients contained in fat, and they also give us a tremendous source of fat-based energy. So another key concept is that there is no fat in isolation. Everything that has any fat has all three fats in it. And we'll go through some examples here. So coconuts and coconut oil, mainly saturated, but they have some monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. 92 saturated, 6 monounsaturated, 2 polyunsaturated. If we look at macadamia nuts, 12% saturated, 71% monounsaturated, 10% polyunsaturated. All right, so 70% butter. Most people think that it's like almost all saturated fat, right? So butter is 70% saturated, 26% monounsaturated, 4% polyunsaturated. Olive oil, 14% saturated, 73% monounsaturated, 13% polyunsaturated. So it's dominant in unstable fats. And then we have bacon, which everybody would just assume is high in saturated fat, and it's actually very low in saturated fat. 37% saturated fat, 44% monounsaturated, 18% polyunsaturated, right? But the big takeaway here is that all fats are a combination of all the fats, period. Anything that has some fat in it is going to have a combination of all three fats. They may have a dominant source of one of the fats and then a very small amount of one of the fats, but they're all going to have all three fats. So it's impossible to avoid any fat. And it's very interesting that Mother Nature packaged all three fats together all the time in every fat that you consume. Even fruits and vegetables have traces of fat. And this is a label pulled from the UK, which, American labeling laws and just the way we do things is just bizarre, but we don't have the full information all the time or the most accurate information. But you can see here on a package of strawberries, it's got 0.5 grams of fat, which means that it also has some saturated fat and some monounsaturated and some polyunsaturated. So just very interesting. You can't avoid it, So, quote to yourself and others as it pertains to what we just learned. There is no fat in isolation. Everything that has fat has all three types of fat. All foods, including fruits and vegetables, have at least a little fat. Therefore, all foods have some saturated fat. I feel like that's almost mind-blowing. Now, on this topic of, is saturated fat harmful, is it good for you, this is the lipid hypothesis, which is the prevailing mainstream narrative, medical narrative around fat and cholesterol, for the past, 60, 70 years now. Eating too much fat, saturated fats, number one, can raise your bad cholesterol in your blood, the LDL. Number two, which can increase the risk of heart disease. All right, so if we look at this statement and we try to prove these different little mini statements, they're all false, okay? First of all, LDL is not cholesterol. LDL is a carrier of nutrients, and one of those nutrients is cholesterol. But HDL is also a carrier of nutrients. It's a lipoprotein. They're both lipoproteins, and they both carry nutrients. One of the nutrients happens to be cholesterol. So cholesterol is exactly the same in HDL as it is LDL, because cholesterol is just cholesterol. There's no such thing as good or bad cholesterol. Now, does eating saturated fat raise your LDL? Well, actually, it's completely neutral, because if you look at blood work, if you look at a group or a population's blood work, you're going to see that those that eat saturated fat, some have raises in LDL, some have lowers in LDL. And so it ends up being a complete wash, right? So that part of it is completely false. It is not an absolute that when you eat saturated fat, you're going to have your LDL raised. And many of us that have embarked on real food have noticed this. Actually, we've seen our LDL go up and down, and we're eating the same amount of fats or increased fats. So then the second part of the statement is, well, first of all, if that's false, then we can already say that the last part of the statement is false, but we're going to go ahead with it, right? Which can increase the risk of heart disease. So then that's the next question. Is high LDL an indicator, or does it increase your risk of heart disease? And there is no proof of that either. I mean, if you look at all cardiovascular events, cardiac events, and cardiovascular deaths, again, half of them, 50%, die, half the people die with high LDL levels or high total cholesterol, and half of them die with normal or low LDL and low total cholesterol. So then the question is LDL even a bad thing? But even if it was, saturated fats have a neutral impact on LDL, and LDL has not been proven to increase the risk of heart disease. Now, for more information, I'm pulling up a post in our group right now, which is a comprehensive post on cholesterol. And in here, if you want to dig a little bit deeper into this and not just trust my word for it, I've got some people that I absolutely love and admire in the lipid biology and just cholesterol realm. So I've got some of my favorite resources, including Dr. Malcolm Kendrick and Ivor Cummings and Chris Kresser and Paul Saladino. And if you scroll down just a little bit more, I've got some you must listen to or watch episodes on YouTube or podcast, and they talk about this topic in detail, but in a way that you can understand in layman's terms. Okay, they talk about cholesterol, LDL, heart disease, and if you watch the YouTube video versions, you'll see like a lot of great graphics, super fascinating stuff. And then if you go a little bit further, you'll see what we consider to be myths and truths about cholesterol, what to look for in the standard lipid panel, standard deviations, and things like that. Cholesterol levels across the world. So this has turned out to be a really great resource, and we keep updating it as we get new information. The second thing I want to point out in our community is our blood work recommendations. Okay, so when we come down here looking at our blood work recommendations, we're looking for metabolic health and low inflammation. And so we recommend a fasting insulin, a standard lipid panel, CBC count, a CMP, full thyroid, a CRP or high sensitivity C-reactive protein, ESR, and then free testosterone for men. Okay, if you have a good fasting insulin, if you have good blood pressure, and if you have lipid numbers that look, and let me just show you what we recommend to be some good numbers when it comes to lipid numbers here. So what we're looking for is low triglycerides, ideally below 100, and high HDL, ideally above 50. All right. Total cholesterol below 300, which most people are going to fall into that if they have low triglycerides, high HDL. And LDL is irrelevant in most situations. Not to say it's not giving you some kind of information, but it's not what we've been led to believe. Now, for more information on cholesterol, one of the best experts, in my opinion, is Zoe Harcum, and she's got a great website. And if you just go to the link that I have here on the U.S. Dietary Guidelines, I've never seen such a comprehensive resource of information on fat and saturated fat and cholesterol and heart disease. It's just amazing. All right, so to answer that question, is saturated fat harmful? No, it's not harmful. Not in the context of eating a real food diet. Not in the context of eating real food the way that we recommend, where we're eating, like our big plate where we have animal foods and traditional fats and vegetables and greens and a smaller amount of carbohydrates. Saturated fat is extremely helpful in that context. All right, so now the question is, even though saturated fat is not bad for you, how much saturated fat is actually in meat? So we've got this chart here that we put together, and we pulled nutrition data for chicken breast and pork chop and sirloin steak and lamb shoulder and lard, just as a fat comparison, to give you the grams. These are measurements in grams of water and protein. So this is 100 grams of these foods, And this is the amount in grams of water and protein and fat and things like that. So as an example, we got chicken breast, 70 grams of water, 21 grams of protein, 8.5 grams of fat. And that is broken down into 2.7 grams of saturated, 3.8 grams of mono, 2 grams of poly, which percentage-wise, that means 32% saturated, 45% monounsaturated, 24% poly. All right, so in chicken breast, we have 32% saturated fat of the total saturated fat. If we look at pork chop, we see similar numbers. All right, we got 3 grams, 3.5 grams, and 1.2, but percentage-wise, in pork chops, we got 39% saturated, 45% monounsaturated, and 16% polyunsaturated. So something that we can draw from this is a lot of people are like, well, I'm going to eat chicken breast because, pork chops are so full of fat, saturated fat, right? And it's not that different from chicken breast, honestly. And if we look sirloin steak, we've got 39% saturated, identical to pork chops, just a little bit higher than chicken at 32%. We've got 56% monounsaturated fat, which even, the most die-hard registered dietitian, people in the mainstream narrative would say monounsaturated are the healthy fats like olive oil and avocado oils. It's mainly monounsaturated fat, and then 6% polyunsaturated fat. But again, none of these animal foods have dominant saturated fat compared to the other fats. In fact, they are dominantly unsaturated fats, especially if you combine the mono and poly together, right? If we look at lamb shoulder is relatively higher. It's got 47% saturated fat, 45% monounsaturated, and 9% poly. And I think most people would agree that most people would say that lamb is healthier for you than beef or steak. And here we see lamb has the most saturated fat of all the different animal foods that we're comparing. All right. So I think that's just fascinating info. What can we take from that? Well, first of all, meat is mostly water, then it's protein, and then it's fat. And within the fat, it's mostly unsaturated fat. So this is a great picture from Zoe Harcum's website. She gave us permission to use it. It is supposed to be an image of a steak, and we see here that the majority of the steak is water. The next majority of the steak is protein, and then fat is a small section of the steak, and within that, it's saturated fat is 0.2% of that total. So if we wanted to have a useful quote for ourselves and others based on this information, first of all, meat is not, quote unquote, full of saturated fat. And the second quote to yourself and or others would be, saturated fat is the last and the least thing that meat is, period. So now let's finish with consumption guidelines, like how much do we want to consume of these things. So we have consumption guidelines inside our Mastering Real Food for a Lifetime guide, and what we say here is consume traditional fats with everything that you eat, whether it's the fat contained in the real food or adding additional fat. This will ensure that you're taking advantage of all the benefits of healthy fats. There's no need to be neurotic about amounts. Just cook with a reasonable amount of traditional fats like butter and ghee and coconut oil. Use a reasonable amount of olive oil and avocado oil for dressings, okay? So, basically you're just eating real food, all right? Eat real food because it will give you the perfect balance of fats. Use traditional fats as necessary for cooking and recipes and avoid those highly processed plant-based oils. And do not consume the dominant polyunsaturated, polyunstable fats on purpose, such as corn, canola, vegetables, soybean, and all the things that we recommend people avoiding, right? So again, our definition of real food, our big plate, animal foods, is a huge piece of it because of the nutritional value that we get from it. And also, we've got some of the fat-based energy tied into that, but we've also got our traditional fats, so we always want to use the traditional fats when cooking. And then we have our vegetables and greens that you can eat any way you want. We recommend that you cook your vegetables, especially your hearty vegetables, to make them easier to digest. The softer the vegetables, such as in some soft greens, the less of the need to cook. And then we've got our smaller plate of our carbohydrates, which is our safe starches and fruits. And if you tolerate full-fat dairy, then we'd love to sprinkle in full-fat dairy here and there for the nutritional value and the fat-based energy as well, all right? But if you eat your meals in proportion to what this image depicts here, then you're going to be doing really good for your health, and you're going to be consuming the proper amount of fatty acids in the correct balance, and you're going to feel freaking amazing, and you're going to look, feel, and perform it to yourself and to other people and your blood work over time. All right, so I'm going to finish with a quote from Dr. Zoe Harcum, and this is awesome. All right, given that we must, let me start over, quote, given that we must consume fat to survive, let alone thrive, and given that we cannot avoid saturated fat, it would make no sense that nature has provided component parts of food which are trying to help and harm human beings at the same time. Using a 100-gram steak as an example, it is difficult to accept that the 39% of the fat which is saturated is damaging the cardiovascular system, while the 61% of the fat which is unsaturated is protective. Keeping in mind that the total fat content of the steak will provide all but 3 of the 13 vitamins and 16 minerals that are a prerequisite for the maintenance of good health. I mean, could not have said it better. Perfection. All right, and that is it. You guys are freaking awesome. Thank you for paying attention and hanging in there with me. I hope this gave you some useful knowledge and some confidence in what you're doing, and also the ability to speak intelligently. All of the notes and resources will be associated with the video and post inside Superhumans United. And if you're not a part of it, you need to get in there at community.superhumantransformation.com. We would love to see you there. Please send us your questions, comments, feedback, and snide remarks. Y'all keep it real.